Well, as the debate over a carbon tax intensifies in this country, some new survey results tonight to give us an idea where Canadians are on the issue of climate change and how they want their political leaders to deal with the problem. David Coletto is the CEO of Abacus Data, and he's here to give us some insight and analysis of his survey of Canadians on carbon pricing and electoral politics. David, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Thanks for coming in to talk about this. Why don't we start first with, as we always do, with the methodology? What do we need to know about these survey results before we start talking about them?
We conducted this survey between October 24th and 29th, interviewed over 1,600 Canadians, representative sample, coast to coast, age, gender, education level, and region. So it's a good representative sample of the country.
Okay, let's start with how the climate ranks as an issue. How big of a problem is this for Canadians? And you can walk us through it by party support and the regions too.
Sure. So first off, most Canadians, at least 3 out of 4, say climate change is either a very big problem or a moderately big problem. A smaller group, about 1 out of 5, say it's not that big a problem or not a problem at all. So there's a broad recognition that this is a problem. In fact, for 40%, they say it's a very big problem, and on a list of other issues we might measure, it falls somewhere not at the very top of that issue set, but somewhere in the middle. So issues like cost of living, housing affordability are higher, but climate change, I think, is slowly rising as a top issue. Now, when we compare, though, across party, you see an interesting difference. So among Liberal and NDP supporters, far more likely to identify climate change as a problem and a very big problem. For Conservatives, they are less likely, although it doesn't mean there aren't any who don't see it as a problem. In fact, 1 out of 5 Conservative supporters say climate change is a very big problem. So it's a complicated issue for Conservatives. Yes, most of their supporters don't think it's a big issue that the government necessarily needs to deal with, but there is a sizable group of their own base that views this problem as something worth focusing on.
Okay, your survey also found the majority of Canadians believe the world is warming and that human activity is part of the problem. And a majority also believe it's possible to reduce the effects of climate change. So let's look at that. What are Canadians saying about the government's approach to pricing carbon as a way of fighting climate change?
You know, as a first step in this survey, we said we gave them a little bit of information about the announcement that the government made around a national price on carbon, in particular sort of the backstop for those provinces that they felt didn't have sufficient pricing in place. 6 out of 10 Canadians, 59%, said they think that the federal approach is a step in the right direction. 41% felt it wasn't. So not overwhelming support for it, but not a sizable majority saying it's on the other side either. And the same kind of breakdown as we talked about earlier. Liberal supporters, New Democrats, far more likely to think this is a positive step. Most Conservative supporters think it's not, but 35% even of Conservatives think that this is a step in the right direction. Interestingly, from a regional perspective, the prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, basically split 50-50 on whether this was a good approach or not, which might surprise some of your viewers from Alberta, where there would be far more resistance to this. But in Ontario, in Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and British Columbia, we get large majorities saying this is a good step for the government.
And what happens when you introduce the rebates that households are getting in these provinces where the government backstop has been put in place? Provinces that the government feels don't have an adequate plan, so the government's imposing a price on carbon, but they're rebating the money to households.
Well, when you tell people you're going to get some of that money back, or maybe more than you might pay to the tax, we find resistance softens, right? So support is around 40%, either support or somewhat support it. A large number of Canadians say, I don't necessarily love the idea of a new tax, but I can accept it, which is a way we measure the sort of reaction to this. About 1 out of 4 Canadians say they still oppose this. So what it does, that approach to giving some of that money back in a rebate, is it softens the opposition to it, and it takes away one of the vulnerabilities of a carbon tax, and that is questions around affordability. And is this going to hurt my pocketbook? If you're giving me a check once a year or every month, or however the government's going to do it, it makes people a little more comfortable with the idea.
Right. It seems to me, would complicate the Conservative narrative a little bit, because the narrative for the Conservatives is this is nothing but a tax grab.
Right.
And if people see, well, okay, if it's a tax grab, but the money's coming back to you, it makes it less of a tax grab.
Deflates that argument, yeah.
Okay, Canadians do, though, have concerns about the effects of a carbon tax, both on the cost of living and the effect on carbon emissions. So, okay, you have a plan. What's it going to do to me, and how much of an effect is it actually going to have on the problem? What did you find?
Well, this is where this is a complicated issue, right? And we've done other research that verifies this. But when we ask people, do you think the carbon price, the carbon tax will have a good, bad, or neutral effect on a number of things? About half of Canadians recognize that in some instances it's going to have a negative effect on affordability of everyday life. They get that. That's part of the narrative the Conservatives and opponents of this have been saying, but they understand that when you put a tax on something, it will cost more. So there's some sensitivity there. On the flip side, while more people feel that this tax will, for example, reduce emissions, increase innovation in the economy, maybe in the future make our economy even more healthy than perhaps it is today, more people say that there's going to be a positive effect than a negative effect. But the bulk of the public is in the middle. They're not sure what effect this is going to have. And so this comes back to communication and persuasion that on something as complicated as climate change, which we pretty much all recognize is happening, we all think it's a problem, we're not quite sure that this policy instrument is actually going to have a big effect, which is why I think there's still room for debate on this issue and why the government's not in the clear despite what seems to be some positive reaction initially from the public.
All right, let's move to the way this could play out for voters in the upcoming election campaign. We know that Andrew Scheer has said, look, job one, if there's a Conservative government, we're punting, scrapping the carbon pricing scheme from the Liberals. That'll be his first priority. Is he in sync with voters?
Well, I think first off, a very small minority say the carbon tax will be the most important factor in how I'm going to vote. 7% say that. So by all accounts, most Canadians don't want necessarily the next election to be about the carbon tax. Many say it's going to be a factor in how they vote, but only a small number. And interestingly, it's not just Conservatives who say it's going to be the most important issue. About a sizable number of Liberal and NDP and Green Party supporters say it will be an important issue to their vote. But when it comes to how they react, I think, to this issue, I think it becomes both an opportunity, obviously, for the Conservatives, or they wouldn't be doing it. They wouldn't be making it central. But I think the data increasingly suggests to me and to our team that there's some risk here for the Conservatives. That if more and more Canadians recognize there's a problem, if they want government to do it, and they actually are buying into the idea of a price that they get a rebate connected to, where's the space for the Conservatives to offer up an alternative? And I think that remains the biggest challenge for the Conservatives.
Okay, and what about how much faith the voters are putting in our political leaders to tackle climate change? What did your survey show?
This is the most interesting, I think, data that we asked. We asked people, of the three main party leaders, we tested Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Singh, and Mr. Scheer. For example, do you believe that they are committed to doing everything they can to deal with this issue of climate change? And what's telling is more people think Prime Minister Trudeau is than not, although a sizable group say he's not, which tells you they've got risk on the more environmental side of their coalition, or even among Green and NDP supporters, that maybe they're not doing enough, as some environmentalists have said. But for Mr. Scheer, 34% say he's not, and only 19% say he is committed to doing everything he can. But the bulk say, I'm not sure yet, I can't tell. And so this goes to motive, it goes to motivation. And the Conservatives can put a plan on the table, but if a large number of Canadians, particularly those who care deeply about this issue, don't feel he has skin in the game, he's not willing to do everything he can to solve it, I think that becomes an interesting wedge that perhaps the next election could be centered on. And it appears to me the Liberals increasingly want that fight. That's why they took the action that they did and are framing it in that way.
That speaks to motivation. Let's talk about plans. What do they say about who's got the best plan to fight climate change?
Well, right now, I think for most Canadians, the only plan that's on offer is really the one put forward by the federal government. So, when you ask people which leader has the best plan, the Prime Minister wins of all the leaders that we tested. 27% picked Prime Minister Trudeau, 11% said Andrew Scheer has the best plan. Elizabeth May comes third at 9% and Jagmeet Singh at 5%. But what's interesting is a sizable group say none of the above, that they aren't hearing what they think they should be hearing. And 1 out of 4 say they're not sure. So there's still lots of game left, I guess, is a way to put it in how this all plays out. But right now, it appears advantage Liberals, mainly because they're the first to they're the first movers in this, and they've put the plan forward, and right now people are reacting to that.
Right, and Andrew Scheer keeps promising that Conservatives will have a plan to deal with climate change. We haven't said much about the NDP and Jagmeet Singh. What's the message in these results for the NDP?
I think there's two. One is, as I said, there's a 30% group in this country who think the government or the Prime Minister is not doing enough or isn't committed to doing everything he can to solve this issue. So there's potentially some space. On the flip side, I think lots of risk that you could get squeezed out from a polarized debate between carbon tax, no carbon tax, action aggressive action on climate change, less aggressive action on climate change, and therefore, where's the New Democrats fit in that debate?
All right, David Coletto, always good to hear from you. We have some numbers that we can put behind the conversation around the debate and who's saying what and why, and this helps all of us understand a little more about what Canadians are thinking and why that might influence what we hear from our political leaders. Good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Peter.